My name's is Catherine Morgan, but everyone calls me Kate. I'm 58 years old, and the moment I stood up in that briefing room, told a four-star admiral that my son was betraying the Navy, I knew I'd just destroyed my family forever. The projector's glow washed over faces too young to remember the Cold War, too confident to imagine sabotage from within. David stood near the front, arms crossed, jaw clenched in that way he'd inherited from his father. Except James had used that expression when protecting people. David wore it while selling them out. Every head turned toward me like I detonated a grenade in church. 50 pairs of eyes, most belonging to sailors who could have been my children, all wondering why the old lady tech was interrupting a flag officer mid-sentence. The kind of silence that precedes either revelation or humiliation. And at my age, you learn those two often arrive together. They thought I was just some widow trying to hold on to a paycheck after her husband died. They had no idea I'd been investigating my own son for 6 months, and they absolutely didn't know I owned $42 million in assets they assumed had vanished with James's death. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before that morning, before the accusations and the handcuffs and the choice between country and blood, I was simply invisible, the way women my age learn to be. 3 gray Tuesdays ago, I woke in the house James built, the one he'd promised would be our retirement dream. Virginia morning light filtered through curtains I'd chosen 30 years back, when choosing curtains felt important, when being a good wife meant making a home while your husband made history. The bed stretched too wide now, cold on the side where James used to generate heat like a furnace, even in his 60s. 18 months since the heart attack, 18 months of learning how silence has weight, how empty rooms echo differently when nobody's coming home. I pulled on the Navy-issue utilities they'd given me at onboarding, the fabric stiff and foreign against skin that remembered silk blouses and pearls. The mirror showed a woman my mother's age, though Mom had died at 62, younger than I was now. Gray streaked through hair I'd stopped coloring because nobody noticed anyway. Glasses perched on my nose because vanity felt ridiculous at this point. I looked exactly like what they expected. Obsolete. The drive to Norfolk Naval Station took 40 minutes through traffic. That made me grateful for something to occupy my mind besides the math of loneliness. How many dinners for one? How many times I'd set 2 plates before remembering? How David's last visit had lasted 20 minutes, most of it spent on his phone. I'd met James when I was 22, fresh out of MIT with a computer science degree and prospects at NASA. He'd been a young naval engineer with eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and hands that could rebuild an engine or hold a baby with equal confidence. We married within a year. David arrived 14 months after that. I gave it all up. The career, the coding, the dreams of programming satellites. Because in 1987, they told young women that good mothers stayed home. So I stayed. I watched James build Morgan Tech solutions from our garage, watched him turn defense software contracts into a $40 million empire, watched him become the man I'd helped him be while I packed school lunches and volunteered for PTA, and learned to smile when people asked what I did, as if raising a child wasn't doing anything. James died before he could see David fall apart. Maybe that was mercy. Or maybe, somewhere in whatever comes after, he was watching and couldn't intervene, couldn't stop our son from making the choices that would bring us all to this. The heart attack came without warning, the way they always do in stories but never feel like they will in life. One minute, James was laughing at some joke on the evening news. The next, he was on the floor, clutching his chest, eyes wide with the shock of betrayal by his own body. I held him while we waited for the ambulance. His last words were my name, just Kate, but in a tone that held everything: love, regret, fear, goodbye. The funeral was enormous. Colleagues, former sailors, competitors who respected him, senators whose campaigns he'd funded. David stood beside me in his dress uniform, dry-eyed and rigid, shaking hands with the efficiency of someone checking items off a list. During the reception at our house, I overheard him talking to one of James's former partners. "Your mother must be devastated." David's response came without hesitation. "She'll be fine. She never really understood what Dad did anyway. She just stayed home." The words landed like shrapnel. I stood behind the kitchen door, holding a tray of untouched pastries, understanding for the first time that my son saw me the way the world did. Decorative, simple, past tense. The lawyers read James's will 3 weeks later. I'd expected some complex division of assets, trusts, stipulations. Instead, it was shockingly direct. Catherine Louise Morgan receives 100% ownership of Morgan Tech Solutions, all associated assets, properties, and accounts. The company valuation at time of death, $42.3 million. David went white. I watched the blood drain from his face like someone had opened a valve. But what about me? His voice cracked on the last word. 20 years old again. The boy who'd skinned his knee and needed mom to fix it. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia who'd known James for decades, didn't even glance up from her papers. Your father's will is clear. Your mother inherits everything. The drive home from that meeting was silent. David gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him from flying apart. I tried to reach for him, offer comfort, but he flinched away. When we reached my house, his childhood home, he didn't come inside. He sat in the driveway, engine running, waiting for me to leave so he could. I stood on the porch and watched my son drive away, understanding that something had fractured that wouldn't heal quickly, maybe wouldn't heal at all. I met with Patricia alone the next day, in her office that overlooked the Chesapeake Bay. She poured coffee from a French press, the kind of small elegance James had always appreciated. I wrapped my hands around the cup, needing its warmth. James wanted you to have everything. Patricia settled into the chair across from mine, her expression gentle but firm. He said you'd sacrificed your career for him, for David. This was his way of honoring that. I don't know anything about running a tech company. You don't have to. I've arranged for a management team to handle day-to-day operations. You'll remain CEO in name, but they'll do the work. All you need to do is sign things occasionally and collect dividends. And David? Patricia's pause said everything. James was concerned about David's spending, his choices. He wanted to ensure your security first. He hoped that David would mature, build his own path, not rely on inherited wealth. So he cut him out completely. Not completely. David has a trust that opens when he's 35. $500,000. James thought that was enough to help without enabling. David was 27 then. 8 years of watching his mother sit on an empire he believed should be his. 8 years was a long time to nurse resentment. I took Patricia's advice, signed the papers that kept Morgan Tech running without me, collected the dividends that arrived quarterly, numbers so large they felt obscene for someone who'd once clipped coupons. The money sat in accounts I barely touched. It felt like blood money, payment for a life I hadn't chosen, compensation for dreams deferred so long they'd fossilized. David joined the Navy 6 months after the funeral. He told me over the phone, his voice carrying that edge of defiance children never quite outgrow. I think it's time I make my own path, like Dad did before Morgan Tech. I understood what he wasn't saying. Before you. Before he married you. Before he sacrificed his naval career to build a company you now control without earning. I'm proud of you, David. I meant it. Whatever complicated feelings churned between us, I wanted him to succeed, to find purpose, to become the man James had seen potential for. The calls grew less frequent. Holidays became brief, obligatory. When I asked about his life, his voice carried the flat politeness of someone talking to a stranger. When I asked about his finances, he changed subjects. I learned to stop asking, learned to accept whatever scraps of connection he offered, because at 57, newly widowed, watching your only child drift away while you rattled around in a too-large house filled with ghosts felt like drowning in slow motion. 6 months ago, I saw the advertisement. The Navy was hiring civilian contractors for technical positions at Norfolk, entry-level systems technicians. No experience necessary beyond basic computer literacy. Training provided. I stared at that posting for 3 days, read it until I'd memorized every word, imagined walking into a recruitment office, telling them I wanted to work, that I needed something to do besides water plants and organize photos from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Everyone would think I was insane. A 58-year-old woman taking an entry-level position meant for kids barely out of high school. But the alternative was driving to the grocery store as my primary human interaction, was falling asleep to Netflix because silence made the ringing in my ears unbearable, was becoming the invisible widow my son already thought I was. I applied online at 2 in the morning, 3 glasses of wine deep, certain I'd never hear back. They called the next day. The recruiter sounded young enough to be my grandson. "Mrs. Morgan, I'm looking at your application. He paused, clearly searching for diplomatic phrasing. "You're certain you can handle the technical demands? Some of our systems are quite advanced." I wrote Pascal code in 1982. I helped design user interfaces for early personal computers. I debugged COBOL for fun. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I made my voice small, uncertain. "I'm a quick learner, and I really need this." The interview was worse. 3 people younger than David, trying not to look at each other when I struggled to answer questions about modern systems that had existed since the 90s. I played my part. The widow who needed structure, who wanted to feel useful, who wouldn't cause problems because she was just grateful for the chance. They hired me for the worst shifts: overnight console monitoring, weekend equipment checks, the jobs nobody wanted, assigned to the person they assumed couldn't handle anything important. Perfect. I reported for my first day on a Monday that felt like the first day of school. Except I was older than most of the instructors. They issued me a badge with a photo that made me look even older. Utilities that hung loose because I'd lost weight since James died. Equipment I had to sign for like I might steal it. The supervisor, a lieutenant named Stevens, who couldn't have been older than 35, walked me to my station with the exaggerated care of someone helping a confused grandmother cross the street. "This is your console, Mrs. Morgan. Do you know how to use a tablet?" I do. I kept my voice bright, helpful, harmless. "The systems are pretty complex, but don't worry. The other techs can help if you get stuck." He gestured to a group of 20-somethings clustered around the break room coffee maker, their laughter loud enough to carry. They looked over, assessed me with the dismissive glance youth reserves for age, then returned to their conversation. I settled into the chair, 3rd row, console on the left, the exact position I'd requested in my application. The least visible, the easiest to overlook, the perfect place to watch without being watched. The work was mind-numbing, running diagnostic checks on communication systems, logging results, flagging anomalies for senior techs to investigate. I could have done it in my sleep. I designed better interfaces than this before David was born. But I acted confused, asked obvious questions. Let the younger techs explain things with the patient condescension of youth teaching age. "Thank you so much. You're so smart." I smiled and nodded and let them feel superior, while I memorized access protocols, system hierarchies, and who had clearance for what. 3 weeks in, I saw him. David walked past my section, shoulders back, uniform crisp, insignia identifying him as a senior chief. My breath caught. He didn't know I was here. We hadn't spoken in 2 months, and I hadn't told him about my new job because part of me suspected this: that he was stationed at Norfolk, that the Navy was smaller than it seemed, that our paths would cross. "David?" My voice came out wrong, too hopeful, too needy. He stopped mid-stride, turned, face cycling through surprise to shock to something harder. "Mom." The word carried no warmth. "What are you doing here?" "I work here now." I stood, suddenly aware of how the utilities hung on me, how my hair had gone more gray than brown, how I must look to him, desperate, pathetic, chasing after her son's world because she had none of her own. "You didn't tell me. I didn't know you were stationed here." His eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't be here. This isn't the place for you." Not concern. Warning. His gaze flicked to the techs watching our interaction, to Lieutenant Stevens approaching with curiosity, back to me with something close to panic. "I just wanted to feel useful, David." I made my voice small again, the helpless widow routine I'd perfected. "After your father." "Don't!" He cut me off, voice low and sharp. "Don't make this about Dad." He walked away before I could respond, disappearing through a security door that required a clearance level I didn't have. The other techs pretended they hadn't been watching. Stevens cleared his throat. "That was... Senior Chief Brennan uses his middle name. Most people don't know his last name is Morgan. He's my son." The admission felt like exposure, like I'd revealed something I couldn't take back. "Oh." Stevens blinked, recalibrating his assessment of me. Well. He walked away without finishing, and I understood. I'd just made my son's professional life complicated by existing in his space. David avoided me completely after that. If I entered a room, he found reason to leave. If I asked a question in briefings, he never made eye contact. When I tried to catch him in the parking lot after shift, he drove away before I reached his car. I told myself it was hurt feelings, embarrassment at having his mother working a job meant for kids his age. But something in his avoidance felt different. Not shame, fear. I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. Started noticing when David logged into systems, when he stayed late, when he met with civilians I didn't recognize. Started seeing patterns that didn't make sense unless something was very wrong. The first anomaly appeared on a Wednesday night. I was running routine diagnostics on the communications node for the USS Truman, the carrier currently docked at Norfolk. The system flagged a minor irregularity in the timing protocols. Nothing that would trigger alerts, just a hiccup that made the data flow stutter for half a second. I almost logged it as routine. Almost. But something about the code fragment looked intentional, deliberate, like someone had embedded it on purpose. I ran a deeper scan, the kind we weren't supposed to do without authorization, the kind most techs my age wouldn't know how to run. The code was beautiful in its malice, a backdoor hidden inside legitimate protocol updates designed to activate on specific triggers. And it had a signature, K7, 3 characters that meant nothing to official Navy documentation, everything to someone who knew what they were looking for. I checked the access logs. The code had been uploaded 6 months ago. The user ID belonged to Senior Chief David Brennan. My son had installed malware into a carrier strike group's communication system. I sat in the empty operations center, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and felt the floor drop out of my world for the second time in 2 years. First James's death, now this. The understanding that David wasn't just distant, wasn't just angry about the inheritance. He was compromised. He was selling out his country. For what? Money? Ideology? Revenge against a father who'd cut him out of a will? I needed to know. Needed to understand before I made any decisions that couldn't be unmade. So I did what any mother would do when discovering her child might be a traitor. I investigated him. The insurance records were easy. I was still listed as David's emergency contact, which gave me access to his health portal. And health portals, if you know where to look, link to financial information for billing purposes. HIPAA violations aside, I needed the truth. David owed $380,000. The breakdown made my stomach turn. Gambling debts, cryptocurrency investments that had collapsed, personal loans from sources that didn't report to credit agencies. The kind of debt that destroys careers, ruins lives, makes desperate men do desperate things. I found the email in his archived messages, the one that confirmed everything. Final notice. Payment in full by end of quarter, or we contact your chain of command. The sender was listed as Financial Solutions LLC, which was code for loan sharks who discovered their client wore a military uniform. I sat in my car in the base parking lot and cried. Not the delicate tears of sad movies, but the ugly, choking sobs of a mother realizing her child was drowning and she'd been too self-absorbed to notice. Too busy being the grieving widow, too comfortable in my own pain to see his. James would have known what to do. James always knew what to do. But James was ash in an urn on the mantle. And I was alone with this knowledge that could destroy whatever remained of my family. I could pay off his debts. $42 million bought a lot of second chances. But if I paid them, David would know I'd been investigating him. He'd know I had access to his private records. And more than that, paying them wouldn't fix what was broken. He'd planted malware for money, but the real damage was to his integrity, to his soul. Giving him cash would only enable him to fall further. I needed evidence, needed to understand the full scope of what he'd done before I decided whether to protect him or expose him. So I kept working the overnight shifts, kept playing the confused older woman who needed help with basic tasks, kept watching while everyone else looked away. The K7 code wasn't isolated. I found it on 5 ships in the strike group. Destroyers, cruisers, supply vessels, each installation expertly hidden, each one capable of disrupting communications during a crisis. Whoever had hired David wanted the ability to blind an entire carrier battle group. I traced the signature backward through system logs that most techs couldn't access, through security protocols I'd learned to bypass back when firewalls were new. The trail led to a company called Apex Defense Solutions. They were Morgan Tech's biggest competitor, locked in a bitter rivalry for a $200 million Navy contract. A contract that would likely go to whoever's systems proved most reliable during next quarter's readiness exercises. If Morgan Tech's software failed spectacularly, Apex would win by default. I pulled Apex's financial records through public databases and industry contacts I'd maintained from James's funeral networking. Found the payment, $50,000 listed as consulting fees to David Morgan, paid 2 months ago. The same week his debt notices had become urgent. My son had sold out his country, his father's legacy, and his mother's company for enough money to buy a decent car. I wanted to scream, wanted to shake him and demand how he could be so stupid, so short-sighted, so willing to destroy everything for something so small. But screaming wouldn't fix this. Confronting him would only drive him underground, make him better at hiding. No, I needed a different approach, needed to be what he already thought I was, harmless. I started asking David for help, small things. The kind of questions a confused older woman might ask her son about technology she didn't understand. He responded with irritation most times, one-word answers that made clear I was interrupting something important. But occasionally, when no one was watching, I'd catch something in his expression, guilt, maybe, or fear that I'd somehow discover what he was doing. "Can you show me how to check the encryption protocols?" I'd ask, making my voice uncertain. I keep getting error messages I don't understand. "Figure it out yourself, Mom. I'm busy." He'd walk away, but not before I saw him glance at the console I'd been working on, saw him check what I'd been accessing, saw him worry. Perfect. Let him think I was incompetent, let him believe I couldn't possibly discover what he'd buried deep in the system architecture. Meanwhile, I worked overnight shifts, when the operations center was mostly empty, when I could run deep scans without anyone questioning why the old lady tech was suddenly so proficient. I found more than malware. Found communication logs between David and email addresses registered to Apex Defense. Found encrypted messages I couldn't read but could timestamp, could match to cash transfers that appeared in his account, then vanished just as quickly, paid out to his creditors. Found proof that this wasn't a one-time mistake. This was systematic betrayal, months in the planning, carefully executed by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and how to hide it. My son was good at this. James would have been proud of his technical skills if they weren't being used to undermine everything James had built. The note appeared in my locker on a Friday morning. I'd just clocked in for the day shift, exhausted from another night of digging through system logs, when I opened my locker and the folded paper fell out. "Stop digging, go home, or your son loses his career." No signature, but I recognized the handwriting. David's, the same blocky print he'd used since elementary school when I'd helped him practice letters at the kitchen table. He knew. He knew I was investigating, knew I'd found something, knew enough to threaten me with the one thing that might make me stop: his career. The implication was clear. If I kept digging, if I reported what I'd found, he'd spin it somehow, make it look like I was confused, a grieving widow grasping at conspiracy theories, a bitter mother trying to hurt her son after he'd rejected her. I crumpled the note in my hand, sat on the bench in the locker room and felt rage burn through grief, because David had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd threatened his own career to make me stop, which meant he didn't understand me at all. I wasn't the woman who'd sacrificed everything for family. Not anymore. That woman had died with James. The woman I was now understood that sometimes love meant doing the thing that would make your child hate you forever. That night, the base lost power, just for 30 seconds, long enough for backup generators to kick in, for emergency lights to paint everything red, for everyone to pause and wonder what had caused it. Official explanation was a transformer issue, routine maintenance that went wrong. But I knew better. I'd traced David's access logs. He'd been in the power systems an hour before the failure. This was a message. I can do this. I have this kind of access. I can make things go wrong in ways you can't predict. He was telling me he had power. He was wrong about what kind. I started calling people from James's old contact list, the ones who'd done security work for Morgan Tech, the ones who'd owed James favors and now, by extension, owed me. I hired a private investigator named Marcus who specialized in financial crimes. I retained a lawyer named Rachel who handled corporate espionage cases. I moved money from accounts I'd barely touched into accounts designed for war. David thought I was weak because I was old, because I'd stayed home, because I'd let James be the face of Morgan Tech while I raised our son. He had no idea that staying home didn't mean staying ignorant, that I'd been James's sounding board for every major decision, that I'd edited his presentations and caught his errors, and suggested strategies he'd claimed as his own, because that's what wives did in 1990. The skills hadn't atrophied, they'd just been sleeping. Marcus came back with information that made David's debt look like pocket change. Apex Defense wasn't just competing for Navy contracts. They were systematically sabotaging every company in their industry, using a network of compromised personnel, former military with grudges or debts or addictions that made them easy to exploit. David was one of at least 7 people Apex had bought in the last 2 years. This wasn't about my son's poor choices. This was about organized corruption, about a company willing to endanger national security for market share. And David had walked into their trap because he was angry and broke and stupid. The evidence filled 3 file folders: financial records, intercepted emails, screenshots of code with matching signatures, testimony from other Apex victims who'd been caught and turned informant. Enough to bring down not just David, but the entire operation. I stared at those folders in my dining room, the same table where I'd served David birthday cakes and Christmas dinners, and knew I was at the point of no return. I could destroy these files, pay off David's debts, hope he learned from his near miss. Or I could do what James would have done: report it, save the Navy from compromised systems, save future sailors from dying because communications failed at the critical moment, save my son from himself even if he'd never forgive me for it. I called David one last time before I made it official, left him a voicemail because he didn't answer, because he'd stopped answering my calls weeks ago. David, I know what you're doing. I know about Apex, I know about the money. Tomorrow I'm telling the Admiral, not because I want to destroy you, because I love you too much to let you destroy yourself. And David, I'm sorry. Sorry I didn't see your pain sooner. Sorry your father and I failed you somehow. But this ends now. Not with threats, not with silence, with truth. I hung up and sat in the dark house, waiting for him to call back. He didn't. Of course he didn't. What could he say that would change anything? The briefing was scheduled for 1400 the next day. Admiral Thomas Hayes, his senior staff, and every systems officer on base. A quarterly readiness review, routine except for the timing. Morgan Tech's software would be stress tested during the presentation. If it failed, Apex would win the contract. If it succeeded, Morgan Tech maintained its position. David would be there. He had to be. His role as senior chief required attendance at all command briefings. I dressed carefully that morning. Not the loose utilities they'd issued me, but a proper uniform I'd had tailored to fit. I did my hair, put on the minimal makeup I'd stopped bothering with months ago, looked in the mirror, and saw not the invisible widow, but something closer to the woman I'd been at MIT, when I'd believed I could change the world with code and determination. I'm 58 years old. My husband is dead. My son is about to be arrested. And for the first time in 30 years, I feel like myself. I drove to base early, sat in my car, and watched sailors move through their morning routines. Young men and women who trusted the systems David had compromised, who assumed the people protecting them weren't selling them out for gambling money. They deserved better. They deserved the truth, even if the truth would destroy my family. The operations center buzzed with pre-briefing energy. Junior officers checking slides, enlisted techs running last-minute diagnostics, everyone trying to look busy and competent under the weight of Admiral-level scrutiny. I took my seat in the back row, laptop balanced on my knees, and waited. David entered at 13:45, 15 minutes before start time. He scanned the room, saw me, and froze. Our eyes met across the space. I watched him process my presence, confusion, then understanding, then the dawning horror of someone who just realized they'd miscalculated badly. He crossed to me in 3 strides, voice low and urgent. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "My job." I kept my voice pleasant, grandmotherly, the harmless widow everyone expected. "You need to leave, now, not a request, a command." "I don't think so, David." I opened my laptop, pulled up the files I'd prepared. The evidence I'd spent 6 months gathering, the proof that would save lives and end his career. His face went through a dozen emotions in 5 seconds: denial, anger, panic, something that might have been shame if it lasted long enough to identify. Then he leaned close enough that I could smell his aftershave, the same brand James had used. "If you do this, I'll never forgive you." A whisper meant only for me, carrying the weight of a lifetime of our relationship. Every choice I'd made and sacrifice I'd endured, reduced to this moment where I had to choose between his future and my conscience. I know, 2 words, all I could manage without crying. Admiral Hayes entered at exactly 1400. The room snapped to attention. Hayes returned the salute, gestured for everyone to sit, and began his review with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Systems readiness, personnel reports, equipment status, all green, all nominal, all perfect on paper. Lieutenant Stevens stood to give the communications assessment. "Sir, our diagnostics team completed all routine systems checks. All nodes report green." Green. The lie I'd been waiting for, the lie that would give me my opening. I stood up. Didn't think about it, didn't plan it, just stood because sitting felt like complicity. My chair scraped against the floor, too loud in the sudden silence. Every head turned. David's face went pale. "Sir, you need to see this." My voice carried better than I expected, steady despite the tremor in my hands. Admiral Hayes lowered his briefing folder, fixed me with eyes that had probably ended more than a few careers with a glance. "Petty officer." He checked his notes, clearly trying to place who I was, why someone my age was interrupting him. "Morgan. State your reason for interruption." "Sir, I've discovered code fragments in the USS Truman's communications node. They appear to be a hidden override." The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that precedes explosions. David shot to his feet, voice cracking. "She's mistaken, sir." Senior Chief Brennan's tone carried desperation disguised as authority. Admiral Hayes didn't look at him, kept his gaze on me, measuring, assessing. "Petty Officer Morgan, approach." My legs barely obeyed. I walked to the front, laptop clutched against my chest like a shield, aware of every eye tracking my movement. David stood frozen, hands clenched, jaw working like he wanted to speak but couldn't find words that would stop this. I set the laptop on the briefing table, pulled up the first file, the K7 signature, glowing against the black background of the code window. Admiral Hayes leaned forward, studied it with the kind of focus that suggested he knew exactly what he was seeing. This code fragment wasn't built into Navy protocol. I kept my voice clinical, professional, the tone I'd used when presenting to James's board of directors back when I still attended meetings. It's buried behind a false subroutine. It disappeared after initial detection. Someone wiped it from the active logs. Hayes's expression didn't change. "Did anyone else access this data?" "Yes, sir." "Someone altered the logs within an hour of my discovery." I pulled up the timestamp records, the access patterns, the signature that matched David's user ID, though I didn't say that part yet. Needed to build to it. Needed to make it impossible to deny. Senior Chief Brennan exploded. "Sir, this is ridiculous. She's exaggerating. She's my mother. She's struggling since my father died. She's not qualified to make these assessments." The room inhaled collectively. Stevens looked like someone had slapped him. Commander Chen, Admiral Hayes' chief of staff, actually turned to stare at David with open shock. Admiral Hayes held up one hand. Silence fell like a guillotine blade. His voice, when he spoke, could have etched steel. "Senior Chief Brennan, you will be silent." David's mouth worked, but nothing came out. Hayes turned back to me. "Continue, Petty Officer Morgan." I pulled up the next file. The access log showing when the code was uploaded. The financial records showing the payment from Apex Defense. The email excerpts Marcus had obtained through legal but uncomfortable means. And finally, the signature trail that led to one user ID, one name, one person with means, motive, and opportunity. The code was installed 6 months ago. I forced the words past the constriction in my throat. It can paralyze communications across the entire strike group. And the person who installed it... I looked up, met David's eyes across the room, saw him silently begging me not to say it, saw the son I'd raised and loved and failed somewhere beneath the desperate man facing prison. The person who installed it is Senior Chief David Brennan, my son. The explosion of sound was immediate, officers talking over each other, enlisted personnel whispering, Stevens reaching for his radio, Commander Chen standing so fast her chair toppled backward. But I only heard David's voice, raw and broken. "You've destroyed me." Not an accusation, a statement of fact. Admiral Hayes's next words cut through the chaos. "Senior Chief Brennan, you are hereby relieved of duty and placed under arrest pending investigation. Commander Chen, take him into custody." Two masters-at-arms moved forward. David didn't resist, just stood there, hands at his sides, staring at me like I was someone he'd never met. Like I was the traitor. Chen snapped the handcuffs on with professional efficiency, read David his rights in a voice devoid of emotion, started leading him toward the door while everyone watched in stunned silence. He stopped when he reached my row, turned to face me one last time. "Mom." Just that word, carrying 30 years of our relationship, every birthday, every scraped knee, every proud moment and disappointment. All of it reduced to this single syllable that sounded like goodbye. "I love you, David." My voice broke on his name. "I love you enough to not let you destroy yourself." He didn't respond. Chen pulled him forward toward the door, toward the security wing, toward a future that would never include forgiveness from his only child. The door closed behind them. Admiral Hayes's voice brought me back. "Petty Officer Morgan, my office. Now." I followed him in a daze, aware of whispers trailing behind me, aware that I'd just become the woman who turned in her own son, aware that some things, once done, can never be undone. Hayes's office overlooked the harbor. I stood by the window, watching ships bob in their berths, while he made phone calls in rapid succession. JAG, NCIS, security chiefs. His voice stayed level, professional, giving orders that would set investigations in motion, that would unravel not just David's actions, but the entire network he'd been part of. When he finally hung up, he gestured to the chair across from his desk. I sat, hands folded in my lap, and waited for judgment. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Not accusatory, genuinely curious. "Because he's my son." The words came easier than I expected, because I needed to be certain, because if I was wrong, I'd destroy his career for nothing, and because I stopped, swallowed hard. I hoped he'd stop on his own. I left clues that I was watching. I thought if he knew I was investigating, he'd be scared enough to back out, but he didn't. No, sir. He threatened me instead. I pulled the crumpled note from my pocket, smoothed it on his desk. "This was in my locker yesterday." Hayes read it, face unreadable, then looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "You could have walked away, paid his debts, protected him." I could have. My throat burned with unshed tears. But then how many sailors die when communications fail during a crisis? How many families lose someone because I chose my son over their children? Hayes nodded slowly, stood, crossed to the window beside me. We stood together, watching the ocean that had taken so many lives over the centuries, that would take more if people like David succeeded. "Your son wasn't working alone." Hayes's voice was quiet now, almost gentle. "Apex Defense has compromised at least 7 military personnel that we know of, possibly more. This investigation will take months. It will be ugly. And your name will be all over it." "I understand." "Do you?" He turned to face me. "Mrs. Morgan, you're not going to be petty officer anymore. You're going to be the woman who turned in her own son. Some people will call you a hero. Others will call you a monster. Your relationship with David is likely over. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of David's face when the handcuffs clicked shut, thought of him sitting in a cell, hating me, thought of Christmases alone, of birthdays without calls, of growing old without the only family I had left. No. I met Hayes's gaze. I'm not prepared at all, but I did it anyway. Something shifted in his expression. He extended his hand. "Catherine Morgan, on behalf of the United States Navy, thank you." I shook his hand, feeling the weight of everything I'd lost in that simple gesture. Then I asked the question that had been burning since the moment I'd stood up. "What happens now?" "Now?" Hayes released my hand, moved back to his desk. "Now we find everyone else in Apex's network. Now we shut them down. And now you go home, because you're going to need time to process what you've done." The aftermath of Hayes's words settled over me like ash. I nodded, stood, moved toward the door on legs that felt borrowed from someone steadier. Mrs. Morgan. His voice stopped me at the threshold. One more thing. We'll need your full testimony. Everything you found, how you found it, timeline of your investigation. It'll take hours, possibly days. When do you need me? Tomorrow morning, 0800. And Mrs. Morgan, bring your lawyer. This is going to get complicated. I drove home in silence, the kind that feels heavy with everything unsaid. The house, when I pulled into the driveway, looked the same as it had that morning. Same blue shutters James had painted 5 years ago. Same rose bushes I'd planted when David was in elementary school. Same front door we'd carried him through as a newborn. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, unable to make myself go inside. Because once I crossed that threshold, I'd be alone with what I'd done. Alone with the knowledge that I'd chosen strangers over my son, that I'd picked integrity over love. Except that wasn't quite true, was it? I'd picked love, the kind that refuses to watch someone you raised destroy themselves, even if stopping them means they'll hate you forever. My phone buzzed. Text from a number I didn't recognize. This is Commander Chen. I wanted you to know that Senior Chief Brennan is being processed at the Naval Consolidated Brig. He's requested no visitors. I thought you should know. No visitors meant no mother, no goodbye, no chance to explain or justify or beg understanding. I texted back, thank you for telling me. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, what you did took courage, more than most people have. I stared at those words, trying to feel the courage Chen saw, finding only hollowness. Inside, the house echoed. I set my keys in the bowl by the door, the same bowl I'd bought at a craft fair 20 years ago. Back when buying bowls felt important, when making a home was my whole purpose. Walked to the kitchen, stood in front of the refrigerator covered with photos held by magnets. David at graduation, David in his first uniform, David and James on a fishing trip, both of them laughing at something only they understood. I pulled down every photo with David in it, not out of anger, out of self-preservation. Couldn't keep seeing his face, couldn't keep remembering the boy he'd been before debts and desperation turned him into someone willing to sell his country. The photos went into a drawer, joined the note he'd left, the one threatening me. Evidence of love and betrayal and the impossible space between them. I poured a glass of wine I didn't want, carried it to James's study, the room I'd barely entered since he died. His desk still held papers from his last day, a coffee mug with dried residue at the bottom, the reading glasses he'd refused to admit he needed until he couldn't read contracts anymore without them. I sat in his chair, the leather worn to the exact shape of his body, and imagined what he'd say if he were here. You did the right thing. That's what he'd tell me. The hard thing. That's what makes it right. But James had never had to choose between country and child, had never had to watch security officers handcuff his son, had never been called mom in a tone that sounded like an ending. I opened the laptop Chen had returned to me after Hayes's initial review, pulled up the files I'd compiled. 6 months of evidence. 6 months of my son's betrayal, documented with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned to code before it was cool, who'd helped build a tech empire from scratch, who'd been invisible so long she'd forgotten how to be seen. There was more here than David's crimes. The apex connection ran deeper. I'd found 7 other names in my investigation, 7 other compromised personnel, but the financial trail suggested there were more. A whole network of people desperate enough or angry enough or broken enough to sell out for cash. Tomorrow morning, I'd give it all to NCIS. Every name, every transaction, every piece of evidence that would burn Apex Defense to the ground and take down everyone they'd corrupted, including my son. I closed the laptop, finished the wine, sat in the dark study surrounded by ghosts. James's ghost in the chair beneath me, David's ghost in every memory of the boy he'd been, my own ghost in the woman I'd stopped being when I'd chosen marriage over MIT. The phone rang at 2300 hours, late enough that I knew it was important, bad news, the kind of call you get when everything is already broken. So why not shatter it further? Unknown number. I answered anyway. Hello? Kate? A woman's voice, familiar but aged. Patricia. James's lawyer. I just heard what happened. Are you all right? The concern in her voice, genuine and warm, cracked something I'd been holding rigid. No. Voice breaking. No, I'm really not. I'm coming over. 10 minutes. Don't argue. She hung up before I could protest. True to her word, Patricia arrived exactly 10 minutes later, carrying a bottle of expensive scotch and the kind of no-nonsense expression that had made her one of the best lawyers in Virginia. We sat at the kitchen table, the one where I'd served David breakfast before school, where James and I had argued about money and parenting and dreams, where I'd signed the papers that made me a millionaire widow. Patricia poured 2 glasses of scotch, slid one to me. Tell me everything, so I did. The words poured out in a flood. The investigation, the evidence, the confrontation, the handcuffs, the look on David's face. Patricia listened without interrupting, let me exhaust myself, then poured second glasses. You did the right thing. The same words I'd imagined from James. The hard thing. That's what makes it right. I laughed, sharp and bitter. Everyone keeps saying that. The right thing, like there's some cosmic scoreboard, like doing what's right makes it hurt less. It doesn't. Patricia's voice was gentle. It never does. But Kate, listen to me. What you did wasn't just right. It was brave. Most people, when they find out their child is compromised, they cover it up. They enable. They tell themselves they're protecting family, when really they're protecting themselves from making the hard choice. He's going to prison. My voice cracked. My son is going to prison because of me. Your son is going to prison because of what he did. Patricia reached across the table, gripped my hand with surprising strength. You didn't make him plant that malware. You didn't make him take money from Apex. You just refused to let him get away with it. That's not betrayal, Kate. That's love. The hardest kind. The tears came then, finally, hot and fast and endless. Patricia held my hand through all of it, didn't try to comfort or minimize, just bore witness while I grieved the son I'd raised and the relationship I'd just cremated. When the tears finally stopped, she released my hand. You know what happens next? I'm going to be famous. I wiped my face with a napkin. The woman who turned in her own son. They'll write articles, maybe books. People will have opinions. They will. Patricia's smile was sad. Some will call you a patriot. Some will call you heartless. Most won't understand that you can be both, that you can love your child and still refuse to let him destroy himself and others. She stayed until past midnight, until I'd stopped shaking, until the scotch had smoothed some of the sharp edges off my grief. When she finally left, she paused at the door. Kate, James would be proud of you. And someday, maybe, David will understand that you saved his life, even if he can't see it now. I wanted to believe her. Chose to believe her because the alternative was unbearable. I didn't sleep that night. Lay in the too large bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every choice that had led here. If I'd stayed at NASA, would David have turned out different? If I'd fought harder for my career, shown him that women don't have to sacrifice everything, would he have learned different lessons about worth and value? Or was this always inevitable? A young man raised in privilege, watching his father build an empire, expecting to inherit something that never materialized, learning too late that respect and legacy can't be bought or inherited, only earned? At 0600, I gave up on sleep. Showered, dressed in civilian clothes because I wasn't sure if I was still officially employed by the Navy or if turning in a senior officer meant I'd be quietly asked to resign. Made coffee I didn't drink. Drove to base an hour early because home felt like a mausoleum. The guard at the gate waved me through without the usual ID check. Word traveled fast in military communities. He knew who I was, what I'd done. His expression held something I couldn't quite read. Respect, maybe. Or pity. I parked in visitor parking instead of the employee lot. Another small signal that my status had changed. Walked toward the admin building where Chen had said to meet her, aware of people watching from windows, from parking lots, aware that I'd become notorious in less than 24 hours. Commander Chen met me at the entrance, professional, crisp, but her eyes held warmth. Mrs. Morgan, thank you for coming. We have a lot to go over. She led me to a conference room filled with people, NCIS agents, JAG officers, technology experts from Cybercom, a stenographer to record everything. They all stood when I entered, a gesture of respect that felt unearned. We spent 8 hours going through my evidence, every file, every screenshot, every timeline notation. They asked questions that required me to relive 6 months of investigating my son, 6 months of hoping I was wrong while proving I was right. Around hour 5, one of the NCIS agents, a woman named Ramirez, asked, "Why did you do this yourself? Why not come to us immediately?" Because I needed to be certain. I'd said it before, would probably say it 100 more times before this was over. And because I'm his mother, I had to give him every chance to stop. But he didn't stop. Ramirez's tone wasn't judgmental, just factual. No, he threatened me instead. And that's when I knew he'd gone too far to pull back on his own. Ramirez nodded, made notes, moved to the next question. Professional, efficient, treating my personal tragedy like the criminal case it was. By hour 8, my voice was hoarse and my eyes burned. Chen called for a break, brought me water and a sandwich I couldn't eat. "How are you holding up?" She sat across from me, the conference room temporarily empty of everyone else. "I'm not." Honesty felt easier than pretense. I destroyed my family. I did the right thing. Everyone keeps telling me that, but it doesn't make it hurt less. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My father was a police officer. When I was 16, he discovered my older brother was dealing drugs. He arrested him, personally, put him in handcuffs and took him to jail. I thought it was the cruelest thing I'd ever seen. Didn't speak to my father for 2 years. What changed? My brother got clean in prison, got his GED, then a college degree, got out and became a social worker. Now he helps addicts recover." She paused. "He told me, years later, that getting arrested was the best thing that ever happened to him, because it meant someone loved him enough to say no, to force consequences when he couldn't stop himself." I stared at the water bottle in my hands. David won't see it that way. Not for a long time. Maybe never. Maybe not. Chen's voice was gentle. "But you didn't have a choice, Mrs. Morgan." "Not really. Because the alternative was letting him spiral until he either got caught by someone else or got someone killed. This way, at least you saved lives, including, possibly, his own." I wanted to believe that. Needed to believe that. Because if I didn't, what had I done? What kind of mother chooses strangers over her own child? The kind who remembers that her child is also a stranger to someone else. That every sailor, depending on those communication systems, has a mother too. That love isn't just about protecting the ones you birthed, but about protecting everyone's children, even from each other. The interrogation, because that's what it was even if they called it testimony, ended at 1800 hours. Chen walked me out personally, hand on my shoulder, in a gesture that was probably breaking protocol but felt necessary anyway. "You did good, Kate." She used my first name for the first time. "What happens next won't be easy, but you did good." I drove home in traffic that moved too slowly, giving me too much time to think. The house, when I finally reached it, felt emptier than before. No messages on the machine, no calls, no David saying he understood, he forgave. He realized what I'd done was because I loved him. Just silence. The kind that would fill the rest of my life. I'd chosen truth over comfort, justice over family, the right thing over the easy thing. And now I had to learn to live with that choice. In this too quiet house, with ghosts for company and regret for a roommate. Tomorrow, Chen had told me, the investigation would go public. News outlets, congressional inquiries, public fascination with the mother who turned in her son, fame of the worst kind, notoriety built on family destruction. But tonight, alone in the dark with only memory and scotch for comfort, I allowed myself one truth. I'd do it again. Given the same choice, the same evidence, the same impossible decision between son and duty, I'd make the same call. Because that's what integrity means. Not doing right when it's easy, but doing right when it costs you everything. I raised my glass to the darkness, to James's ghost, to the son who'd never forgive me. And I drank to the rubble of my family, built on love and destroyed by it, gone but not forgotten. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Tonight, I grieved. The morning after arrived with the weight of permanence. I woke at 5:30, not because of an alarm, but because sleep had become a place I visited rather than inhabited. The bedroom held James's absence like a second presence, and now David's too, though his was different. James left through biology's betrayal. David left through mine. The news broke at 6:15. I was standing in the kitchen, coffee cooling in a mug I wasn't drinking from, when my phone lit up with notifications. 20, 50, 100. Text messages from numbers I didn't recognize, emails filling my inbox faster than I could scroll, news alerts pinging with headlines that reduced my life to clickbait. Navy mother turns in son for espionage. Widow exposes defense contractor corruption. 58-year-old whistleblower breaks military spy ring. Patricia called at 6:23. Don't read the comments, don't watch the news, don't respond to any reporters. I'm coming over with a crisis PR team. We need to control this narrative before it controls you. She arrived 30 minutes later with 3 people who looked too young to control anything, but their efficiency suggested otherwise. They took over my dining room, setting up laptops and phones, fielding calls with practice deflections. One of them, a woman named Sarah with sharp eyes and a sharper suit, sat across from me. Mrs. Morgan, in 2 hours, every major news outlet in America will want to interview you. We need to decide, do you speak or do you stay silent? What's the difference? If you speak, you control your story. You explain why you did it. Humanize yourself, make people understand. If you stay silent, other people write your story, and trust me, they'll get it wrong. I looked at Patricia, who nodded. It's your choice. But Sarah's right. Silence creates vacuum, and vacuum gets filled with speculation. What would they want me to say? The truth. Sarah pulled up her tablet, showed me headlines from the last hour. Some painted me as a hero, most painted me as something else. Cold, calculating. The kind of mother who'd destroy her son for glory. Your son is being portrayed as a victim of debt and bad influences. You're being portrayed as someone who chose fame over family. The words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. I hadn't chosen fame, but I had chosen exposure. I'd known this would go public. I'd known my name would become synonymous with betrayal of a different kind than David's. I'll speak. My voice surprised me with its steadiness, but I won't apologize. I won't pretend I didn't know what I was doing. And I won't lie about why. Sarah smiled, the kind of smile predators give when they recognize another hunter. Good. That's what people will respect. Not weakness, not regret, certainty. They prepped me for 3 hours. Anticipated questions, crafted responses that sounded natural while hitting specific points. Sarah was relentless, attacking from angles I hadn't considered, forcing me to defend choices I'd barely processed myself. Why didn't you just pay his debts? You're wealthy. You could have made this go away. 'Cause money doesn't fix broken. It just puts gold leaf on rot. Your son is facing 20 years in prison. How do you live with that? I live with it the same way I'd live with knowing I let compromised communications get sailors killed. Badly. But alive. By noon, I was exhausted and certain I'd made a mistake. Then Patricia's phone rang. She answered, listened, her face cycling through surprise to something closer to alarm. That was Admiral Hayes. He wants to see you, now, at his office. The drive to base felt longer than it was. Traffic moving at speeds designed to maximize dread. I expected Hayes to tell me I was fired, or being investigated myself, or that David had somehow found a way to make this worse. Instead, he was waiting with a woman I didn't recognize. Mid-40s, steel gray suit, the kind of presence that made you stand straighter without knowing why. Mrs. Morgan, this is Jessica Reeves. She's with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Hayes's tone was formal, careful. She has questions about your investigation. Reeves stood, extended a hand. I shook on autopilot. Mrs. Morgan, thank you for coming. What you uncovered goes beyond your son's involvement. We need to understand how you accessed certain information that, technically, you weren't authorized to access. The threat was polite, but unmistakable. I'd hacked systems, accessed files above my clearance, operated outside legal bounds, even if my intentions were pure. Reeves wasn't here to thank me. She was here to decide if I needed to be prosecuted alongside David. I sat without being invited, suddenly too tired to maintain deference. I used my late husband's credentials. James had them written in a notebook in his study. Passwords, access codes, contacts. I knew it was illegal. I did it anyway. Reeves made notes without looking up. Why not come to us with your suspicions? Let proper authorities investigate? Because my son was the suspect. Because I needed to be certain before I destroyed his life. Because mothers don't call the police on their children without absolute proof. Even when their children are committing treason, especially then. Reeves looked up, studied me with eyes that had probably interrogated hardened criminals and found them wanting. You put yourself at considerable legal risk. Unauthorized access to classified systems, violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, potentially obstruction of justice for not reporting immediately. I know. I held her gaze. Charge me if you need to. I did what I did. I'd do it again. Hayes shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the direction this was taking. Reeves's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Respect, maybe. Or recognition of someone who'd made impossible choices and accepted the consequences. We're not charging you, Mrs. Morgan. Her words felt like reprieve and burden simultaneously. What you found has given us leads we wouldn't have discovered for months, possibly years. You've prevented potentially catastrophic security breaches. But going forward, if you discover anything else, you come to us. Understood? There won't be anything else. Bitterness crept into my tone. I was investigating my son. That's over. Is it? Reeves pulled a folder from her briefcase, slid it across Hayes's desk. Your investigation identified 7 compromised personnel. We found evidence suggesting at least 12 more, and the financial trail doesn't end with Apex Defense. It goes higher, much higher. The folder contained names I didn't recognize, transactions in amounts that made David's $50,000 look like pocket change. Former admirals, defense contractors, congressional staffers, a web of corruption so vast that my son was barely a footnote. You're telling me David was small time? The realization made everything simultaneously better and worse. Better because his crimes paled compared to this. Worse because it meant I destroyed my family over what amounted to a rounding error in someone else's empire. Your son made choices. Reeves's voice gentled slightly. Bad choices. But he was targeted because he was vulnerable. Apex, and whoever's behind them, they prey on people with debts, addictions, resentments. Your son isn't unique. He's just one of many. That doesn't make it hurt less. No, it doesn't. But it means you stopping him matters more than you realize. Because every person we catch, every network we dismantle, we learn more about how they operate, how to protect others from making the same mistakes. Hayes cleared his throat. Mrs. Morgan, there's something else. We've received a request from David. He wants to see you. The air left the room. I sat frozen, unable to process what that meant. David wanted to see me. After everything. After the handcuffs in the briefing room and the choice I'd made in front of 50 witnesses. When? Tonight. 1900 hours at the brig. Hayes's expression was unreadable. You don't have to go. He has no right to demand anything from you. But he's asking, not demanding. The distinction mattered, though I couldn't articulate why. He's asking to see his mother. Reeves stood, collecting her folder. Mrs. Morgan, if you go, remember that conversations in the brig are monitored. Anything he says can and will be used in his prosecution. Don't let him manipulate you into saying something that compromises either of your positions. I'm 58 years old. I've been married, widowed, and betrayed by the only child I raised. I think I can handle a conversation with my son without incriminating myself. Reeves smiled, thin but genuine. I don't doubt that. I'm just saying, be careful. Love makes us vulnerable in ways enemies exploit. She left. Hayes walked me to my car, silent until we reached the parking lot. Then, Kate, may I call you Kate? Of course. What you did took courage most people don't have. But courage has costs. Make sure you're prepared to keep paying them. I drove home in a fog. Reeves's folder sitting on my passenger seat like a passenger I hadn't invited. 12 more people. 12 more families about to be destroyed. 12 more mothers or wives or children who'd wake up one morning to find their loved one handcuffed, their life imploded, their trust shattered. Was I responsible for that? By turning in David, had I set a domino chain in motion that would ruin dozens of lives? Or had those dominoes been falling all along, and I just made them visible? Sarah called at 1500. CNN wants you tonight. 60 Minutes wants you this weekend. The New York Times wants an exclusive. Mrs. Morgan, you're the biggest story in America right now. How you handle the next 48 hours will define how history remembers you. I don't care how history remembers me. I care about whether I can look myself in the mirror. Then do the interviews. Tell your truth. Let people see you're not a monster. Let them see you're a mother who made the hardest choice and isn't asking for sympathy. We scheduled CNN for 2200 after my visit with David. Sarah suggested I wear something maternal but professional. Patricia suggested I ignore Sarah's advice and wear whatever made me feel strong. I chose James's MIT sweatshirt, faded and soft with decades of wear, and jeans that had seen better years. The Naval Consolidated brig sat on base like a judgment made concrete. I arrived at 1850, early because lateness felt like cowardice. The guards processed me with efficiency that couldn't quite hide their curiosity. They'd read the news. They knew who I was, what I'd done, why I was here. David looked smaller in prison clothes. That was my first thought when they brought him into the visitation room. Not diminished exactly, but compacted, like someone had taken the man I'd raised and compressed him into a denser, harder version. He sat across from me, separated by a table and a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. He spoke first. "Why did you come?" "Because you asked." My hands lay flat on the table, visible, non-threatening. "Because you're my son." "Am I?" His voice carried none of the anger from the briefing room, just exhaustion. Genuine question. "Because it feels like you chose everyone else over me. I chose country over crime. Not quite the same as choosing strangers over you." Semantics. He leaned back, arms crossed in that defensive posture that had been his default since adolescence. "You knew what would happen. You knew I'd go to prison. You did it anyway." Yes. No point in lying. I knew. I also knew that if I didn't stop you, you'd keep going until you got caught by someone with less mercy than me. Or until your compromised systems got people killed. I couldn't live with either of those outcomes. "So you can live with this? Me in here? Us never speaking again?" The question hit harder than he probably intended. Could I live with this? The honest answer was, I didn't know yet. But the answer he needed to hear was different. "David, you're my son. My only child. Losing you is like losing a limb. But I would rather lose a limb than watch you bleed out from a wound I could have stopped." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I hate you." The words came without heat, just statement of fact. "I hate that you were right. I hate that I proved you right. I hate that I'm sitting here and you're sitting there and there's nothing I can do to fix this." "You don't need to fix it. You need to survive it." I leaned forward, keeping my voice low. "David, you made mistakes. Terrible mistakes that will cost you years of your life. But mistakes aren't endings. They're just extremely expensive lessons." His laugh was bitter. "Expensive, that's one word for it. 20 years, Mom. 20 years of my life. 15 with good behavior." And I spoke to Patricia. "We're going to push for your cooperation to count towards sentencing reduction. If you testify against Apex, against everyone else in the network, you might get down to 7 years. 7 years is still 7 years. 7 years is also not forever. You'll be 45 when you get out. Still young enough to rebuild. Still young enough to become someone who learned from this instead of being defined by it." He stared at the table between us. "Do you know what the other guys in here say? About you? They call you ice bitch. The mother so cold she'd turn in her own son without blinking." "Did I blink?" "What? When I turned you in? When I stood up in that briefing room, did I blink? Because I remember shaking. I remember my voice cracking. I remember watching them put handcuffs on you and wanting to die. So maybe I'm not as icy as everyone thinks." "Then why did you do it?" "Because love isn't always soft." I fought to keep my voice steady. Sometimes love is refusing to enable destruction. Sometimes love is choosing hard consequences now instead of catastrophic consequences later. And yes, sometimes love looks like betrayal from the inside. He wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand, quick and angry, like tears were weakness he couldn't afford. "I thought you'd choose me. You're my mother. Mothers are supposed to protect their kids. I am protecting you. From yourself. From becoming someone who'd have to live with blood on their hands when those systems failed and sailors died. From waking up at 60 and realizing you'd sold your soul for debt payment. I'm already that person, Mom. I already sold out. You can't unring that bell. No." I reached across the table, stopped just short of touching him because physical contact wasn't allowed. "But you can decide what you do next. You can rot in here, bitter and angry, blaming everyone else. Or you can use this time to become someone worth being. Your father built an empire from nothing. You can rebuild yourself from this. Dad would be ashamed of me. The certainty in his voice broke something in me. James would have been heartbroken, yes. Disappointed, absolutely. But ashamed? James, who'd made his own mistakes, who'd grown up poor and fought for everything, who'd always believed in second chances. Your father would have done exactly what I did. I spoke with absolute conviction. He would have turned you in, watched you get arrested, and then spent every day working to make sure you survived it. That's what he did when people messed up at Morgan Tech. Consequences followed by support. Never one without the other. You don't know that. I was married to him for 36 years. I know exactly that. The guard signaled 5 minutes remaining. David's shoulders slumped further, if that was possible. He looked young suddenly, younger than 38, young enough that I could see the boy he'd been, the one who'd cried when his hamster died, who'd brought me dandelions he thought were flowers. Mom. His voice cracked on the word. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I disappointed you. I'm sorry I stole from you. Yes, I know what Apex was trying to do to Morgan Tech. I'm sorry I threatened you. I'm just sorry. I forgive you. The words came easier than I expected. Not because the hurt was gone, but because holding on to it felt like carrying stones I didn't need. I forgive you, David. Now you need to forgive yourself. And figure out how to make the next 7 years count for something. The guard opened the door. Time's up. David stood, hesitated. Then, are you coming back to visit? If you want me to. But I won't come if you're going to use the visits to punish me. I'm done being punished for choosing right over easy. I'm not going to punish you. His smile was small, broken, but real. I might actually need you. For the first time since Dad died, I think I actually need my mother. Then I'll be here, once a week, every week, until you tell me to stop. They led him away. I sat in the visitation room for another 5 minutes, letting my breathing settle, letting the knot in my chest loosen enough that I could function. The visit hadn't fixed anything. We'd never be what we were before. But maybe we could be something new, something built on truth instead of illusion. The CNN interview happened in my living room at 2200. They'd wanted me in studio, full production, but Sarah insisted on home turf. Familiar territory. The interviewer was Anderson Cooper, whose silver hair and serious expression made everything feel more consequential. Mrs. Morgan, you've become the most controversial woman in America overnight. How does that feel? I sat in James's chair, the one from his study that I'd moved to the living room because I needed him present somehow. It feels terrible. I didn't do this for attention. I did it because my son was committing crimes that endangered people's lives. Fame was never the goal. But you knew this would be public. You knew your name would be attached to this. Of course I knew. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally are very different things. My voice stayed level, calm, the way Sarah had coached me. I'd rather be anonymous and have my son free than famous and have him in prison. But I don't get to choose both. Some people are calling you a hero. Others are saying no mother should turn in her child, regardless of the crime. What do you say to that? I say both groups are right in their own way. I paused, choosing words carefully. I don't feel like a hero. Heroes act without cost. What I did cost me my relationship with my son, my peace, my sense of family. But I also couldn't stand by while he endangered thousands of sailors. So I'm not a hero. I'm just a mother who made an impossible choice and has to live with it. Your son was targeted because of his financial vulnerability. Do you feel any guilt that you had money that could have prevented this? The question was the one Sarah warned me about, the one designed to make me defensive, to crack the calm exterior. I have tremendous guilt about many things. That I didn't see his pain sooner, that I didn't stay more involved in his life after my husband died, that I let grief consume me so completely that I missed my son drowning in debt, but paying his debts wouldn't have fixed what was broken. It would have been a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. What was broken? David felt invisible, unvalued, like he'd been written out of his father's legacy. Money wouldn't have fixed that. Only time and therapy and consequences that forced him to reckon with himself. That's what I'm hoping prison gives him. Not punishment for punishment's sake, but space to rebuild who he is. You've been described as cold, calculating, the kind of woman who prioritizes duty over love. Is that accurate? Cooper's expression remained neutral, but the question carried judgment. I met his gaze directly. I'm 58 years old. I've been dismissed as too old, too out of touch, too invisible to matter. I've sacrificed careers and dreams and ambitions to raise my son. And when that son chose to betray his country, I had to choose between protecting him or protecting everyone else. That's not cold. That's called being an adult in a world where not every problem has a good solution. What do you want people to understand about your choice? That love isn't always soft. I leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera now, to the millions watching, to the mothers facing impossible choices, to the people who judge me from the safety of never having been tested. Sometimes love is refusing to enable self-destruction. Sometimes love is saying no when yes would be easier. And sometimes love means watching your child hate you, knowing that hatred might be the thing that eventually saves them. The interview lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Sarah was beaming. That was perfect. You were authentic, vulnerable, but not weak. Firm but not cold. People will see you as human. I don't care what people see. I stood, exhausted to my bones. I care about whether David survives this. Everything else is noise. They left by midnight. Patricia stayed, helping me turn off the lights the camera crew had set up, restoring my living room to its normal shadows. You did good tonight, Kate. Did I? Because it feels like I'm performing my own grief for an audience. You're controlling the narrative. That's different. Patricia settled onto the couch, kicked off her heels. Without you speaking, they'd write whatever story sold clicks. At least this way, they're writing your story. My phone buzzed. Text from a number I didn't recognize. This is David. They're letting me watch the news. You were right. About everything. Thank you for not lying. For not making me the victim. For treating me like an adult who made adult choices. It means more than you know. I showed Patricia the text. She smiled. See? You're already reaching him. Or he's manipulating me. Years of watching courtroom dramas suggested prisoners often told authorities what they wanted to hear. Trust your instincts. Patricia stood, gathering her things. You know your son. You know when he's lying and when he's being real. Don't let fear make you distrust genuine connection. After she left, I sat in the dark, phone in hand, reading David's text over and over. Was it real? Was he really processing this? Or was he playing angles? And did it matter? If manipulation led to genuine change, was it still manipulation? The days that followed blurred together. More interviews, 60 Minutes, the New York Times, People magazine, which felt beneath me until Sarah explained that people reach demographics CNN didn't, that multiple audiences needed multiple approaches. Each interview asked variations of the same questions. Each time I gave variations of the same answers. Each time I felt pieces of myself shearing away, sold for public consumption. But the message seemed to land. Comment sections, which I wasn't supposed to read but did anyway, shifted from condemnation to support. Women my age wrote essays about their own impossible choices, their own moments of choosing hard right over easy wrong. Younger people questioned whether they'd have the courage I'd shown. Veterans thanked me for preventing what could have been catastrophic communication failures. David wrote every 3 days. Short letters, prison monitored, carefully worded. Each one showed growth I wanted to believe was real. Mom, I met with a therapist today. Talked about Dad for the first time since he died. Cried like a child. Turns out I've been angry at him for dying, for leaving me with expectations I couldn't meet. The therapist says that's normal. It doesn't feel normal. It feels like I've been carrying a boulder I didn't know was there. Mom, they're offering classes. Computer science, business management, psychology. I enrolled in all of them. Figure I've got time to actually learn instead of just getting by. Maybe I'll come out of here with more degrees than I went in with. Mom, the other guys in here found out who you are, what you did. Some of them respect it. Some hate you on my behalf. I told them you made the right call, that I needed stopping. One guy said his mother should have turned him in before he shot someone. Said maybe he wouldn't have killed a man if someone had loved him enough to make him face consequences sooner. I think about that a lot. Each letter I answered. Not long responses, not therapy sessions through mail, just acknowledgments that I'd received his words, that I was still here, that I wasn't abandoning him even though I'd betrayed him. Reeves called 6 weeks after David's arrest. "Mrs. Morgan, we need to meet. Something's developed." Her office at the Pentagon was everything you'd expect. American flags, portraits of presidents, windows overlooking DC's power corridors. She gestured to a chair across from her desk, piled with folders I recognized. "My investigation. Expanded. Your evidence led us to General Marcus Webb, retired admiral, now working as a consultant for multiple defense contractors, including Apex." Reeves pushed one folder toward me. "He's been running the network for 5 years. Your son was just one small piece of a much larger operation." "How much larger?" $200 million in fraudulent contracts, 57 compromised personnel across 3 military branches, intelligence leaks that may have cost lives overseas. Webb's operation is the biggest military corruption case in 40 years. The number sat heavy between us. David had thought he was making a quick $50,000 to clear debt. He'd actually been part of something that had killed people, stolen hundreds of millions, undermined national security in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. "And you found all this because I turned in my son." "We'd have found it eventually." Reeves's tone was careful. "But your investigation accelerated our timeline by months, possibly years. Years during which Webb's network could have done exponentially more damage. So David's crimes led to stopping something worse. The thought should have brought comfort. It didn't. It just made everything more complicated, more tangled, more impossible to process as simply good or bad." "There's more." Reeves opened another folder. "Webb knows you're responsible for his exposure. He's not handling it well. We've intercepted communications suggesting he might try to retaliate." "Retaliate how?" "We don't know yet, but I'm recommending you accept security protection, at least until we have Webb in custody." The idea of needing protection, of becoming a target, of this nightmare expanding beyond David's imprisonment felt absurd. I'm 58 years old. I live alone in a house in Virginia. What's he going to do? Have me killed? "Mrs. Morgan, Webb has connections to very dangerous people. People who've committed murder for far less than what you've cost him. Please don't dismiss this threat." I took the security detail because Reeves insisted, and because Patricia threatened to move into my house if I didn't. 2 agents, rotating shifts, sitting in an unmarked car outside my home. It felt like overkill until I found the first letter. It wasn't mailed, wasn't delivered by any service. Just appeared in my mailbox between the morning when I checked and the afternoon when I checked again. Plain envelope, no return address, my name written in block letters. Inside, one sentence. "You should have protected your family instead of strangers. Now you have neither." The security agents took it seriously. Fingerprint analysis, handwriting experts, surveillance footage from my street that showed nothing useful. They increased my detail, added cameras to my property, gave me a panic button I was supposed to carry always. Sarah wanted to spin it. "Show the public you're being threatened. Make people see you're paying a price for doing the right thing." I refused. Turning my fear into content felt obscene. Like monetizing David's imprisonment wasn't enough. Now I had to monetize my own potential murder. David heard about the threats through channels I didn't understand. Wrote a letter that arrived with unusual speed, suggesting someone had expedited it. "Mom, if anything happens to you because of what I did, I'll never forgive myself. Please be careful. Please don't let my mistakes cost you everything." I wrote back, "Your mistakes already cost me everything that matters. Everything beyond that is just details. But I'm being careful, I'm safe. Focus on yourself, not on protecting me. That's my job, not yours." The second threat came 3 days later. Email this time from an untraceable address. Subject line, "Last warning." Body text, "Withdraw your testimony or face consequences." What testimony? I called Reeves immediately. I gave a statement. "The investigation is ongoing. What am I supposed to withdraw?" "Webb's trying to scare you into recanting, saying you were mistaken, that your investigation was flawed, that you can't be trusted as a reliable witness because you were emotionally compromised." Her voice was calm, professional, but I heard the edge underneath. "We've seen this before. When people can't discredit the evidence, they discredit the source. So what do? Nothing. You've told the truth. You have evidence to support everything you've said. Let us worry about Webb. You just stay safe and stay silent. Staying silent felt like cowardice, like letting someone bully me into invisibility I'd spent decades escaping. But staying visible might get me killed, which seemed like a permanent solution to a temporary problem. The CNN interview had been watched by 12 million people. The 60 Minutes piece did even better, 18 million. My face was everywhere. Magazines, news shows, podcasts dissecting my choices and their implications. Someone started a hashtag. Had Ice Mother Justice meant as criticism, but adopted by people who supported my decision. A publisher called, offered the $2 million for a book about my experience. Sarah thought I should take it. Control your story, make it comprehensive, leave a record. I told them no. This isn't a story. It's my life falling apart in public. I don't want to profit from that. But others will profit. Sarah wasn't pushing, just stating facts. There are already 3 unauthorized biographies in development. A Netflix documentary. Probably a Lifetime movie by next year. You can either be part of shaping that narrative or let them make you into whatever sells best. She wasn't wrong, but participating felt like endorsing the spectacle. I compromised. Agreed to one long-form interview with The Atlantic, the kind of deep journalism that might actually capture complexity instead of reducing me to hero or villain. The writer was a woman named Elizabeth Chen, early 50s, who'd covered military affairs for 20 years. She came to my house, sat in my kitchen for 6 hours, asked questions that felt like therapy more than journalism. Do you regret it? She asked simply, no judgment in her tone. Every day. Honesty felt safer than pretense. I regret that my son made choices that required me to choose. I regret that I didn't see his pain earlier. I regret that our family fractured in ways that might never heal. But do I regret turning him in? No, because the alternative was letting him destroy himself and potentially kill strangers. I couldn't live with that. What do you think James would say about all of this? Elizabeth's question hit harder than she probably intended. James had been gone 2 years, but his absence felt fresh, like losing him yesterday. I'd spent so much time wondering what he'd think, what he'd do, what advice he'd give. James would say I did the hard thing. That's what he always valued. Not the easy path, not the comfortable choice, but the hard thing that required sacrifice. I paused, fighting tears that still came too easily. He'd also probably be angry that I investigated David alone instead of asking for help. James hated when I tried to handle everything myself. Why did you handle it alone? Because asking for help meant admitting my son might be a traitor. As long as I investigated privately, I could hope I was wrong. Could hope there was an explanation that would make everything make sense. Once I involved others, it became real. Asking for help meant accepting that David had fallen further than I could catch him alone. The article published 6 weeks later. 8,000 words that captured nuance most media missed. Elizabeth wrote about sacrifice, about invisible women becoming visible through tragedy, about the impossible mathematics of choosing between family and country. She quoted military ethics experts who said I'd done the right thing. She quoted psychologists who said the trauma would mark me forever. She quoted David, who'd agreed to a brief interview through prison authorities. My mother made the only choice she could live with. David's words printed in The Atlantic for millions to read. I hate that she had to make it. I hate that I put her in that position. But I understand now that she saved my life by ending my career. Sometimes love looks like destruction from the inside. I read his words 50 times, tried to find manipulation, tried to spot the angle, found only what seemed like genuine growth. Growth that had cost both of us everything we'd had before, but growth nonetheless. Reeves called the day after publication. We've arrested Webb. Your testimony, combined with the evidence you gathered, gave us everything we needed for warrants. He'll likely die in prison. The news should have brought relief. Instead, I felt hollow. Webb's life ended just as surely as David's had been interrupted. More families destroyed. More people discovering that choices made in desperation or greed or anger cascade into consequences no one fully envisions. There's something else, Reeves continued. Webb's arrest broke the network completely. 57 people are facing charges, but 15 of them have offered to testify in exchange for reduced sentences, including providing evidence that could cut David's time significantly. How significantly? If he cooperates fully, testifies in every trial, we could potentially get him down to 4 years, maybe less with good behavior. 4 years instead of 20. 4 years meant David would be 42 when released, still young enough to rebuild completely, still young enough to have a life beyond this disaster. What does he need to do? Tell the truth. About everything. About Apex, about Webb, about everyone he knows was involved. Complete honesty, no holding back to protect anyone. I'll tell him, but he needs to make this choice himself. I won't pressure him to testify. That has to come from his own conscience. Mrs. Morgan, your son is facing 20 years. Most people would beg him to cooperate. Most people didn't turn their son in. I've done enough choosing for him. This one has to be his. I visited David the next day, told him about Webb's arrest, about the possibility of reduced sentencing, about the choice that was now his to make. He listened without interrupting, face cycling through surprise to calculation to something that looked like resolve. I'll do it. No hesitation. I'll testify against everyone. Not because I want a shorter sentence, though I won't lie and say that's not a factor, but because if I don't, I'm still protecting the people who used me. And I'm done being used. You understand what this means? Testifying makes you a target. The people you'll testify against have connections, resources, reasons to want you silenced. Mom, I'm already a target. I'm already in prison. The worst already happened. His smile was grim but determined. Maybe doing something right for once will actually help me sleep at night. I'm proud of you. The words surprised both of us. Surprised me because I hadn't planned to say them. Surprised him because he clearly hadn't expected to hear them. Really, after everything? Especially after everything, you could have stayed bitter, stayed angry, blamed everyone else. Instead, you're taking responsibility. You're choosing hard right over easy wrong. I'm just sorry it took prison to get you here. We sat in silence for a moment. Then David. I got a letter from Patricia. She said Morgan Tech is doing well, that the Apex contract went to us after their corruption came out, that the company is worth more than when Dad died. It is. I'd been so focused on David, on survival, on managing crisis, that I'd barely paid attention to the business. But Patricia was right. Morgan Tech had benefited from Apex's collapse. The company James built was thriving specifically because I'd stopped the people trying to destroy it. Patricia also said you haven't taken any salary, haven't used any of the money for yourself. I don't need it. The statement was true, but insufficient. The money felt dirty, like profit from David's imprisonment. Using it would be admitting I'd benefited from turning him in, which wasn't true, but felt true, which was close enough to make me avoid it entirely. Mom. David leaned forward, lowering his voice. You need to stop punishing yourself. You did the right thing. You saved lives. You protected Dad's legacy. You even saved me, though I was too stupid to see it at first. The money is yours. Use it. Do something that makes you happy instead of just surviving. I don't know what makes me happy anymore. Then figure it out. Because if you spend the rest of your life flagellating yourself for my mistakes, then I really did destroy everything. Let me at least know that you're okay, that you're building something instead of just existing. The visit ended, but his words stayed with me. I'd been existing, not living, going through motions, managing crises, performing grief and strength for audiences who'd forget me the moment the next scandal broke. When was the last time I'd done something for myself? Something that wasn't about David or James or duty? I called Patricia that night. I want to do something with the money, something that matters. What did you have in mind? David mentioned sailors depending on compromised systems. How many of them have similar issues? Debt, addiction, problems that make them vulnerable to exploitation? Too many. Patricia's voice was careful. Why? I want to start a foundation, something that helps veterans and active service members deal with financial problems before those problems become security risks. Counseling, debt management, emergency funds, prevention instead of punishment. James would have loved that idea. This isn't about James. It's about making sure no more mothers have to choose what I chose. No more families have to fracture like ours did. The Morgan Family Foundation launched 3 months later. Modest at first, just $2 million from my accounts. Staff of 5, office space donated by Patricia's firm. We helped 12 people the first month, 40 the second. By month 6, we'd assisted 200 veterans, clearing debts that averaged $30,000, providing counseling that helped them address the problems creating debt in the first place. Sarah wanted to publicize it. This is your redemption arc, from ice mother to compassionate advocate. The media will love it. I don't care if they love it. And it's not redemption, it's just trying to prevent other families from going through what mine did. The media found out anyway. They always did. Another round of interviews, another cycle of explaining my choices. But this time, I had something to point to beyond pain and sacrifice. I had creation, however small, something built from the wreckage. David finished his testimony rounds 8 months after his arrest. Prosecutors were pleased, said he'd been thorough and credible. Webb's trial would be first, then cascading trials for everyone else in the network. David would testify at each one, reliving his crimes, his mistakes, his betrayal again and again and again. The judge reduced his sentence to 5 years. Not the 4 we'd hoped for, but better than 20. He'd be out when he was 43. Still time to rebuild. Still time to become whatever he chose to become next. I visited weekly. Sometimes we talked about his classes, his therapy, his slow process of understanding why he'd made the choices he'd made. Sometimes we talked about James, about grief, about ways we'd both failed each other, and ways we might repair that failure. Sometimes we just sat in silence, mother and son, connected by biology and betrayal, and something that might eventually become forgiveness. The security detail stayed for 6 months, then scaled back when threats diminished. Webb was in prison, his network dismantled, his ability to retaliate neutralized. I kept the cameras, the reinforced locks, the sense that safety was conditional and temporary. People asked if it was worth it, if I'd do it again. The answer was always the same. I don't know if it was worth it. I only know I couldn't have lived with the alternative. That's not heroism. That's just being human in a world where sometimes all the choices are bad, and you have to pick the least destructive option and learn to sleep at night despite knowing what you've lost. I'm 58 years old. I turned in my son. I became famous for family destruction. I started a foundation from guilt and hope in equal measure. I visit prison every week and try to believe redemption is real. And I'm still learning how to live with the woman I became when I chose truth over comfort, justice over family, hard right over easy wrong. She's not who I thought I'd be at this age, but maybe she's who I needed to become. 3 years passed in the strange currency of prison visits and foundation growth. Time moved differently now, measured not in seasons, but in milestones. David's first parole hearing denied, his second approved. The Morgan Family Foundation helping its 1,000th veteran. Webb's conviction upheld on appeal. My 60th birthday spent alone with a cake I bought myself and candles I didn't light. The foundation had become something larger than I'd imagined. What started as guilt management had evolved into genuine purpose. We'd expanded to 15 employees, offices in 4 cities, partnerships with VA hospitals, and military family support groups. Last year, we'd cleared $8 million in veteran debt, provided counseling to 3,000 service members, prevented what our analysts estimated were at least 40 security breaches similar to David's. Sarah still called occasionally. Pitching interviews I always declined. The public had moved on to newer scandals, fresher tragedies. I'd had my 15 minutes of fame, stretched into 15 months, and was grateful when it finally ended. Being invisible again felt like coming home after a long, exhausting trip. David's release date was set for November 15th, 4 years and 7 months since he began serving his sentence, shortened by cooperation and good behavior, and the kind of model prisoner performance that suggested genuine reformation or excellent acting. I chose to believe the former because the alternative was unbearable. Patricia called on a Tuesday morning, her voice carrying an edge I'd learned to recognize as important news. "Kate, I need you to come to the office. There's something you need to see." The drive to her firm took 40 minutes through traffic that gave me too much time to imagine worst-case scenarios. David had changed his mind about release. Webb had found a way to appeal from prison. The foundation had somehow violated regulations and was being shut down. None of those. Patricia's conference room held a presentation I didn't understand at first. Financial projections, market analyses, valuation reports. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Morgan Tech has received an acquisition offer. Her words were careful, measured. Apex Defense was broken up and sold off after Webb's conviction. Most of it went to various buyers, but one piece, their satellite communications division, is still available. The technology is complementary to what we do. The valuation is favorable. You want me to buy part of the company that corrupted my son? The statement landed flat, without inflection, because I couldn't quite process the irony. I want you to consider turning your company into something bigger. Right now, Morgan Tech is valuable. With Apex's technology integrated, it could be dominant. Patricia pulled up a slide showing projected revenue. We're talking about a company worth potentially $200 million within 5 years. The number was absurd. James had built a $40 million empire over decades. Patricia was suggesting I could quintuple that in 5 years by absorbing the technology of my enemies. Why would I want that? Because Webb's network destroyed lives for profit. You could use that same technology to save lives. Secure communications that can't be compromised. Systems designed from the ground up with integrity instead of exploitation. She leaned forward, intensity in her eyes I rarely saw. Kate, you could build something that ensures no one else's son ever faces the choice David did. The pitch was good, almost too good, which meant there was a catch I wasn't seeing yet. What aren't you telling me? Patricia's pause confirmed my suspicion. The acquisition would require you to become CEO in practice, not just in name. You'd need to run the company, make decisions, be visible again. Everything you've spent 3 years avoiding. I'm 60 years old. I have no business experience. I stayed home for 30 years while James built this company. You also investigated and dismantled the largest military corruption network in 40 years. You built a foundation from nothing that's now operating in 4 states. You've testified before Congress twice about security vulnerabilities. Kate, you're one of the most qualified people in defense technology, whether you believe it or not. The compliment felt like manipulation, but that didn't make it untrue. I had done those things, had learned to navigate systems I'd thought were beyond me, had discovered competence buried under decades of being told my value was in supporting others rather than leading myself. But stepping into that role meant accepting that I'd actually benefited from David's imprisonment, that his crime had created my opportunity. The guilt of that felt insurmountable. If I do this, David can never work for Morgan Tech. I spoke slowly, thinking through implications. He can't benefit from what he tried to destroy. That has to be absolutely clear. Agreed. Patricia made notes. We'll put it in writing. David's trust fund from James stays intact, but he's barred from any role in the company. This is your legacy, not his. When do I need to decide? You have a week. After that, the offer expires and Apex's technology goes to competitors. I drove home in a fog, Patricia's presentation swimming in my head. The acquisition made financial sense, made strategic sense, made every kind of sense except the emotional kind that mattered most. That night, I wrote to David, not my usual letter updating him on foundation work or family news he didn't have. Instead, I told him about the acquisition offer, about Patricia's pitch, about my uncertainty. His response came faster than normal, his handwriting more urgent. Mom, buy it, buy all of it. Take the company that used me and turn it into something that prevents other people from being used. That's not profiting from my mistakes, that's redeeming them. 3 days later, I wrote back, I'm worried that becoming CEO, becoming visible again, means turning into someone I don't recognize, someone who uses family tragedy as a business opportunity. David's next letter was the longest he'd ever written. You're not using tragedy. You're refusing to let tragedy be the end of the story. Dad built Morgan Tech to protect people. Apex corrupted that mission. You buying them isn't exploitation. It's justice. You're taking the weapons they used against us and turning them into shields. That's not cold calculation, Mom. That's exactly what Dad would have done. His words released something I'd been holding rigid for 3 years. He was right. James wouldn't have let moral complexity paralyze him. He'd have seen the opportunity to turn an enemy's strength into protection for future victims, and taken it without hesitation. I called Patricia. Make the deal. The acquisition took 4 months to finalize. Lawyers, regulators, technology assessments, due diligence that uncovered problems we had to fix before closing. I spent those months learning to run a company I'd inherited but never operated. Patricia hired consultants who taught me things James had probably tried to teach me decades ago when I'd been too focused on David to listen. The new Morgan Defense Solutions, we dropped tech in favor of something more comprehensive, launched in March. Press release, industry coverage, interviews I couldn't avoid if I wanted the integration to succeed. I sat for Fortune magazine, Forbes, Defense News, explaining how a 60-year-old widow had gone from invisible housewife to CEO of a $100 million defense contractor. The reporter from Fortune, a young woman named Michelle, who couldn't have been older than 30, asked the question everyone was thinking. Do you feel guilt about building an empire from your son's crime? Every single day. No point in lying, I feel guilt about everything. About not seeing David's problems sooner, about turning him in, about benefiting from the technology that corrupted him. But guilt without action is just self-indulgence. So I take the guilt and channel it into building something that prevents future mothers from facing my choice. That's a very rational approach to trauma. I'm 60 years old. Rationality is what you develop when emotion becomes too expensive to maintain. The article ran with the headline, "The Ice Mother's Redemption: How Kate Morgan Turned Family Tragedy into Defense Industry Leadership." The nickname had stuck, would probably follow me forever. I'd learned to accept it, even embrace it. If people wanted to think I was cold, calculating, unfeeling, fine. Let them. Their opinion didn't change what I knew about myself. David was released on November 15th as scheduled. I picked him up from the prison at 8 in the morning, watching him walk through the gates in civilian clothes that hung loose on a frame that had gotten leaner, harder. He was 43 now, graying at the temples like James had, carrying himself with a wariness that suggested prison had taught him things I'd never learn. We stood in the parking lot 5 feet apart, neither quite knowing how to bridge the distance. Then he crossed it in 3 strides and hugged me with an intensity that suggested he'd been saving it for years. I'm sorry, muffled against my shoulder, for everything, for what I did, for what you had to do because of it, for the years we lost. Just sorry. I held him tighter. You already apologized. Multiple times. You don't need to keep apologizing forever. Maybe not forever. He pulled back, wiped his eyes. But definitely today. We drove to the house. My house, not ours, because he couldn't live there until he completed parole requirements. Stopped for breakfast at a diner where he stared at the menu like it was written in code. 5 years of cafeteria food. I forgot there were this many options for eggs. Start simple, work your way up to complicated. He ordered scrambled eggs and toast, ate slowly, methodically, the way people eat when they've learned not to take food for granted. Between bites, Patricia told me about the acquisition, about Morgan Defense. You really did it. I really did. Still felt surreal admitting it. Your father would be proud, or horrified, maybe both, definitely both. His smile was the first genuine one I'd seen since before James died, but mostly proud. You took everything that went wrong and built something that prevents it from happening again. That's what he always said was the mark of good leadership, turning mistakes into lessons. The waitress refilled our coffee. David watched her walk away, absorbing the simple freedom of watching strangers in a diner, doing things he couldn't do for 5 years. What happens now? I asked it carefully, not wanting to push, but needing to know. What do you want? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I want to teach. I got 3 degrees in prison: computer science, business ethics, psychology. I want to teach veterans about financial literacy, about recognizing when you're being targeted for exploitation, about asking for help before problems become crises. I want to be what I needed 5 years ago. The foundation could use someone like that. The words were out before I thought them through. We're always looking for people who understand the vulnerability from experience. Mom. His voice was gentle, but firm. We both know I can't work for you. The optics alone would destroy everything you've built. The woman who turned in her son then gave him a job. The media would crucify you. He was right. Frustratingly, completely right. So you'll do it independently. There's a nonprofit in Baltimore that works with at-risk veterans. They've offered me a position, lower pay than I'd make elsewhere. But that's kind of the point. I need to rebuild credibility before I can rebuild anything else. I'm proud of you. The words came easier now than they had in prison. You could have come out bitter, broken, blaming everyone else. Instead, you're choosing service. I learned from my mother. She faced a choice most people would have run from, made the hard call, then spent 5 years building something meaningful from the wreckage. That's a pretty good template. We finished breakfast. I drove him to the halfway house where he'd live for the next 6 months, hugged him goodbye, and watched him walk inside, shoulders straight, head up, carrying himself like someone who'd survived something that should have destroyed him. The foundation continued growing. By year 4, we'd helped 5,000 veterans, cleared $30 million in debt, prevented an estimated 100 security breaches. We'd also identified patterns, the ways debt collectors targeted military personnel, the specific vulnerabilities that made service members attractive to corruption networks. I testified before Congress again, this time with data instead of just personal experience. Military personnel are 3 times more likely to have debt in collections than civilians. They're targeted by predatory lenders who know they can't file bankruptcy while serving. They're compromised by foreign actors and criminal networks who exploit that financial stress. And we, as a nation, make it worse by paying them barely enough to survive, then acting shocked when desperation makes them vulnerable. The testimony went viral, which Sarah said was exactly what we needed. Senators introduced legislation based on our research. The Department of Defense updated financial counseling programs. Small victories that wouldn't undo what happened to David, but might prevent it from happening to others. Morgan Defense was thriving. The integration of Apex's technology had created communication systems that were genuinely more secure than anything else on the market. We'd won 3 major contracts, hired 200 employees, expanded into cybersecurity and satellite technology. The company James built had transformed into something larger, more sophisticated, more aligned with preventing the exact corruption that had nearly destroyed it. I was featured on this cover of Time magazine for the second time in 4 years. The article was titled, "The Invisible Woman Who Changed Defense: How Kate Morgan Rewrote the Rules at 60. They used the Ice Mother nickname in the subhead, but the piece itself was respectful, acknowledging complexity instead of reducing me to villain or hero. David called the day the issue hit newsstands, "Mom, you're on Time. You're literally on Time magazine." It's not a big deal. It's a huge deal. You're 61 years old. You run a major defense contractor. You've changed policy at the federal level. You've helped thousands of veterans. And you did it all after the hardest moment of your life. That's not just a big deal, that's legendary. His pride felt unearned but wonderful. This is your story too, David. Your mistakes led to all of this. My mistakes gave you raw material. What you built from that material, that's all you. We'd found our rhythm, David and I. Weekly phone calls, monthly dinners now that he'd completed parole and moved into his own apartment. Our relationship would never be what it was before. The mother who'd packed his school lunches and the son who'd trusted her implicitly were both gone, replaced by 2 adults who'd survived trauma together and were learning to exist in its aftermath. He thrived at the Baltimore nonprofit, started a program specifically for service members facing debt, combining financial counseling with psychology and ethics training. Success rate was 93%. Participants who completed his program were 40 times less likely to fall into the kind of desperation that had consumed him. The invitation came on a Wednesday, delivered by courier to my office. Embossed envelope, formal cardstock, the kind of invitation that suggested significance. You are cordially invited to speak at the Kennedy Center Honor Ceremony, recognizing individuals who have made extraordinary contributions to national security. The event would honor 5 people, including me, for work that had fundamentally enhanced the safety and integrity of American defense systems. I called Patricia immediately. "This is ridiculous. I turned in my son and bought a company. That's not Kennedy Center material." "Kate, you prevented potentially catastrophic communications failures. You've changed how the military approaches financial vulnerability. You've built systems that are the gold standard for security. That's absolutely Kennedy Center material. I'm 61 years old. 3 years ago, nobody knew my name. Now I'm being honored at the Kennedy Center. This feels like they're celebrating family destruction. They're celebrating courage. There's a difference." I almost declined. Almost wrote a polite note explaining that I didn't deserve recognition for making the only choice my conscience allowed. But David convinced me otherwise. Mom, go. Accept the award. Let people see that doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything, matters. Let other mothers know that choosing hard truth over easy lies is worth honoring. You're not celebrating what happened. You're celebrating that you survived it and built something meaningful. So I went. Wore a gown Patricia insisted I needed, sat in the Kennedy Center surrounded by military brass and defense officials and politicians who'd ignored me for 58 years and now wanted photos. The presenter was Admiral Hayes, who'd been promoted twice since David's arrest, who'd sent me quarterly notes checking on my well-being with the consistency of someone who actually cared. Catherine Morgan came to Norfolk Naval Station as a grieving widow looking for purpose. Instead, she found corruption that threatened thousands of lives. What she did next required a courage most of us can't imagine. She investigated her own son, gathered evidence that would destroy her family, and brought it forward knowing the cost. Hayes's voice carried across the auditorium. But she didn't stop there. She turned tragedy into prevention, built an organization that's protected thousands of service members from similar exploitation, and transformed a company compromised by corruption into the industry standard for integrity. The applause felt distant, like it was meant for someone else. I walked to the stage in a daze, accepted the Crystal Award that weighed more than seemed reasonable, stood at the podium looking at faces I didn't recognize who were standing to applaud me. I'm going to tell you something unpopular. My voice cut through the applause, quieting the room. What I did wasn't heroic. It was necessary. Those are different things. My words echoed in the vast space. Heroes act without cost to themselves. What I did cost me my relationship with my son for years. It cost me peace, sleep, the ability to feel anything except guilt and responsibility. So I'm not a hero. I'm just a mother who made an impossible choice and then had to figure out how to live with it. The room was silent now, everyone listening. But if this award means anything, let it mean this. We honor the people who make hard choices instead of easy ones. We honor the mothers and fathers who love their children enough to refuse to enable their destruction. We honor the invisible people, especially the women, who've spent their lives supporting others and finally stepped forward when it matters most. Age isn't obsolescence. Experience isn't irrelevance. And sometimes the people everyone underestimates are exactly the ones who change everything. The applause this time felt different. Not polite ceremony, but genuine response. People weren't clapping for me turning in David. They were clapping for the idea that invisible people matter, that late-life transformation is possible, that tragedy doesn't have to be an ending. David was there. I'd gotten him tickets, third row, where I could see him through the stage lights. He was crying openly, not bothering to hide it, just letting tears run while he clapped until his palms must have hurt. Afterward, in the reception, he found me. That speech, Mom, that speech was everything. I just told the truth. You told the truth everyone needed to hear. That loving someone sometimes means stopping them. That being underestimated is a superpower. That 61-year-old women can change the world. He paused, searching for words. You know what Dad would say if he saw this? What? He'd say, I always knew you were stronger than me. I'm just glad everyone else finally figured it out. The validation from my son, earned through years of prison and growth and hard rebuilding, meant more than any award. Webb died 3 months later. Heart attack in federal prison, his second since incarceration. The warden called as a courtesy. Thought you should know. Marcus Webb passed this morning. No foul play suspected. Just a 70-year-old man's body giving up. The news should have brought closure. Instead, it just felt like one more ending in a story that had too many already. Webb's corruption had ruined dozens of lives, killed people through intelligence leaks, undermined institutions meant to keep us safe. His death meant he'd never fully face consequences for all of it. But it also meant the threat was gone. The security detail I'd kept for 3 years could finally be released. The cameras could come down. I could sleep without wondering if someone was coming for revenge. Patricia handled Webb's estate, which was complicated because most of his assets were being seized for restitution. But there was one thing the government didn't take. A letter Webb had written, addressed to me, sealed with instructions to deliver upon his death. I opened it alone in my study. James's chair cradling me while I read words from a dead man who tried to destroy my family. Mrs. Morgan, you won. Completely and thoroughly. You dismantled everything I built, sent me to prison, took my company's technology and made it better. You should feel triumphant. But I want you to know something. I understand why you did it. I have 3 children. If any of them had been in your position, faced with the choice you faced, I'd want them to have your courage. I'd want them to value integrity over comfort, truth over loyalty, right over easy. I spent 5 years in here hating you. Then I spent 2 years understanding you. You weren't my enemy. You were just the one person who refused to look away. The world needs more people like you. I hope your son knows how lucky he is that you loved him enough to destroy him. That's a gift most people never receive. With respect, even from the grave, Marcus Webb. I read it 3 times, then filed it with David's letters. Evidence that even people who commit terrible acts can eventually understand the people who stop them. David came for dinner that Sunday, our new ritual now that he had stability and freedom. We cooked together. He'd learned culinary skills in prison that put my decades of experience to shame, and ate at the table where I'd once served him birthday cakes. Over dessert, he asked, "Do you regret it? Any of it?" The question I'd answered for reporters, for Congress, for myself 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. But answering David required different truth. I regret that you were in pain I didn't see. I regret that desperation led you to choices that cost years of your life. I regret that our family fractured in ways that can't be completely repaired. His eyes held mine across the table. But do I regret stopping you? No, because you're alive, you're free, you're doing meaningful work. If I'd stayed silent, you might be dead. Or still in there, serving 20 years, becoming someone neither of us could recognize. So no, I don't regret the choice. I just regret that the choice was necessary. You know what I regret? David's voice was soft. I regret being the reason you had to choose. But I'm grateful, so grateful that when you did choose, you chose the hard right instead of the easy wrong. Because if you'd chosen differently, I'd still be drowning. I just wouldn't know it. We finished dessert in comfortable silence. 2 people who'd survived something that should have destroyed both of them, and somehow found grace in the aftermath. Morgan Defense hit the $1 billion valuation mark in my 63rd year. Patricia called with the news, her voice carrying the kind of excitement that suggested she'd been waiting to tell me. Kate, you did it. James built a $40 million company. You turned it into a $1 billion empire. The number was abstract, meaningless except as validation that the company was thriving. But what mattered more was what we'd built. Systems that couldn't be compromised the way David had compromised them. Security protocols that made it exponentially harder for corruption to take root. A culture that treated ethics as non-negotiable, where asking for help with financial problems was encouraged rather than stigmatized. We'd hired 200 veterans, many of them people the foundation had helped, giving them second chances that proved people aren't their worst moments. David's story became training material, not as cautionary tale but as example of how vulnerability gets exploited and how prevention works better than punishment. I stepped down as CEO at 65, transitioning to chairman, while a younger woman took operational control. She was brilliant, 42, everything I'd given up being when I'd chosen marriage over MIT. Watching her lead what I'd built felt like completing a circle, like proving that invisible women can become visible and then make space for others to shine. The foundation passed its 10,000th veteran helped. We'd cleared $200 million in debt, prevented an estimated 500 security breaches, changed federal policy on how military financial stress gets addressed. David had become National Director of Prevention Programs, traveling to bases teaching the lessons he'd learned the hard way. We appeared together for the first time publicly at a veterans conference in San Diego. Panel discussion on security vulnerabilities and how to address them before they become threats. The moderator asked David directly, "How does it feel working alongside the mother who turned you in?" David smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd made peace with things I was still processing. "It feels like love, not the easy kind that enables and excuses, the hard kind that refuses to watch someone destroy themselves. My mother saved my life by ending my career. That's a gift I spent 5 years learning to appreciate. Now I spend every day trying to give that same gift to others. The intervention that hurts in the moment, but saves you in the long run. The audience applauded. The moderator turned to me. Mrs. Morgan, same question. How does it feel? It feels like we both survived something that kills most families. We're not who we were before. We're not what anyone expected us to become. But we're here. We're doing work that matters. And we're doing it together, even though we're doing it separately. I paused, finding words for complexity that resisted summary. Love isn't always soft. Sometimes love is choosing consequences that hurt now instead of catastrophe that destroys later. I'd make that choice again, but I'm grateful I'll never have to. Later, in the hotel bar, David and I sat with drinks. Neither of us was really drinking, just holding glasses that gave us something to do with our hands. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Dad had lived? David's question carried weight, years of what-ifs compressed into a single inquiry. If he'd been there when I fell apart? Every day. James's absence still ached like a healing wound that never quite closed. He would have seen your pain, would have intervened before it got this bad, would have saved us both from the choices we had to make. Or maybe not. David's voice was thoughtful. Maybe I needed to fall all the way down. Maybe having Dad there would have just meant another person enabling me, keeping me afloat without addressing why I was drowning. Maybe the only way I learned to swim was by hitting bottom. That's very philosophical for someone who spent 5 years in prison. Prison gives you a lot of time to get philosophical. We laughed, and it felt good, laughing about something that had nearly destroyed us both. The laughter of survivors, people who've been through fire and found humor in the ashes. The house that was finally just mine instead of mine and James's ghost waited for me in Virginia. The foundation was thriving, the company was thriving, David was thriving. Everything I'd built from the wreckage of that November day when I'd stood up in a briefing room and destroyed my family was now bearing fruit I'd never imagined. Some choices don't have answers, just consequences you learn to carry. What I carried was this. I was 65 years old. I'd been invisible for most of my life, then infamous for 5 years, then transformed into someone who changed industries and saved lives and proved that it's never too late to become whoever you're meant to be. I'd lost my husband to biology, my son to consequences, and found them both again in different forms. Age isn't weakness. Experience isn't irrelevance. Being underestimated isn't tragedy. It's opportunity disguised as dismissal. And sometimes the people everyone overlooks are the ones who see clearly enough to change everything. My name is Catherine Morgan. I'm 65 years old. I turned in my son to save him. I built an empire from family destruction. I helped thousands of people avoid the mistakes that nearly destroyed us. I'm not a hero. I'm not a villain. I'm not the Ice Mother, though that name will follow me until I die. I'm just a woman who made impossible choices and then had to figure out how to live with them. Who learned that love sometimes looks like betrayal from the inside. Who discovered that 60 isn't too old to start over, to become someone new, to matter in ways you never imagined. If you're a woman who's been invisible, underestimated, dismissed as too old or too inexperienced or too anything, your story doesn't end when other people stop seeing you. It begins when you decide they're wrong. I spent 30 years invisible, then 5 years infamous. Now I spend every day trying to be useful, taking the hardest moment of my life and turning it into something that prevents other families from facing similar choices. Courage isn't acting without fear. It's acting despite terror that you're making the wrong choice. Love isn't always gentle. Sometimes it's refusing to enable destruction, even when enabling would be easier. And transformation isn't reserved for the young. It's available to anyone willing to let their old self die, so their true self can finally breathe. I was invisible until I wasn't. I was nobody until I was somebody. For me, that moment was standing up in a briefing room when everyone expected me to stay silent. For you, it might be something completely different, but it will come. And when it does, remember, age isn't the end of possibility. It's the beginning of wisdom that only survival teaches. Be brave, be ruthless when necessary, be kind when possible, and never ever let anyone convince you that being underestimated is weakness. It's the greatest advantage you'll ever have.